The book starts out with the disappearance itself and all of the Morgantown Police and the West Virginia State Police involvement with that up until when the girls are found. And then it focuses on the trials 1 and 2 with Eugene Clausen, and we talk about the possibilities of yay or nay and that. I think it's fair to say we both don't think that he did it. And then we start talking about some other possible suspects that there might be. For anyone who's listened to the podcast, there are some extra suspects that we didn't have enough time to talk about on the podcast.
And a lot more details than we could talk about on the podcast about all the suspects.
Right. So after we go through those suspects, then we talk about our experiences separately, and then when we started working together. So that's kind of how the book progresses.
Well, I was here when it happened, and so I, of course, heard all the news about the missing girls and all that kind of thing. And then when I was in high school, I attended Clausen's first trial in '76 with my girlfriend. We skipped school, and we were both pretty convinced that he didn't have anything to do with it. We were kind of amazed that he got convicted because there was no evidence to speak of except his confession. And in reality, when we dug into it, he confessed a bunch of times, partial confessions, and changed things all the time.
He had some motive to. In his mind, he was a little learning disabled, so in his mind, he had this plan to be proven that it wasn't him that killed Merritt and Karen, so he would be able to be moved to a facility that was closer to where his mother lived, and it just really wasn't grounded in reality.
Yeah, he also said that he thought he would be let loose if he was not convicted in Morgantown. He would come to Morgantown, they would give him a sodium pentothal, and then they'd prove that he didn't do it, and then they'd let him go, so he would get out of prison in New Jersey. For some reason, he thought that was the plan.
I guess they thought they'd shorten his sentence in New Jersey. It's such a weird story because it wasn't planned at all, but my husband, when he was my fiance, he was going to Spain for 2 weeks. Friends of his were having a wedding, and I don't know, I just got this idea in my head. I remembered when my parents had talked about Merritt and Karen, and I wanted to look into it because it just seemed so surreal. It didn't...
Strange.
Yeah. So I started doing some research into it, and I found out there was a whole lot to the story that I had never even been told. I did a write-up, I put it on Reddit's Unresolved, and I met Kendall before I met Jeff, and we were standing on Kendall's porch, and I said, hey, you just bought this house, would you like to hear about the worst crime that's ever happened in Morgantown? So I gave him the rundown on it, and he's like, do you want to make a podcast? I'm like, sure, what's a podcast? And then the article that I wrote did its rounds. It was on Facebook. It got the attention of Jeff, and we were able to connect, and we had dinner and discussed the murders, and he's like, do you want to write a book? I'm like, sure, what's a book? So it all came together almost exactly at the same time, and it's been pretty serendipitous. Yeah, it's definitely more difficult. I think the Morgantown Police Department doesn't keep any files older than 1980, so it was just happenstance that he had been shadowing someone who had the actual files, or otherwise they would have been destroyed. Yeah. There wasn't much information online except what he was posting, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to get hold of him. He seemed to know a lot about the case.
I shadowed a state trooper, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hall, back in 2006 to about 2009 or 10, and he was investigating the case. He had an involvement in the case. Actually, he took Clausen's confession and was sent up there to corroborate the confession, get his feeling about the guilt. And he said that Clausen he was lying, and but apparently a lot of other state troopers didn't feel that way. And then there was, of course, the prosecutor in Morgantown. So the case, Clausen was convicted, but Richard was still sure that he didn't do it. So
Convicted twice.
Yeah, convicted twice, convicted in 76 and 81. It was closed at the time, but Richard had it reopened. You know, he met with, because he was, you know, had a long tenure on the state police and he was retired, he made some discoveries and asked the, I think it was Colonel Lemon at the time, the superintendent, and apparently the case was reopened at that point.
I'm not really sure that they made very many safety changes. I mean, the PRT did come into existence, but we can't find any evidence that there's any correlation between the two.
And I went through 3 boxes of Samuel Elias's papers, and he's the one that was in charge of the PRT project and ended up, you know, in the transportation project. He didn't say anything in testimony. He testified before Congress, all kinds of things. There was no evidence that it actually had come because of the Coed murders, the PRT. That seemed to be just solving a WVU transportation problem because 2 campuses.
So there was little done about sort of like safety with the hitchhiking and everything like that.
I think women in general stopped hitchhiking if they could help it, but I don't think that the university really did a whole lot for safety concerns. Eventually, Beverly Manor was closed. It was no longer a dorm, so there was no issue with the buses not being able to get out there because it wasn't a dorm anymore. But other than that, I can't really say that a lot of safety precautions were taken.
And around town, I hitchhiked up through high school and stuff, so guys, I think, kept hitchhiking, but a lot of women stopped, and you didn't see the big knots. You used to see dozens and dozens of students on Grumbine's Island and around that way on the layer steps and hitchhiking. And the car would stop, and they'd all pile in as many people could fit as possible, and then it would drive away. And so it was real common for everybody to be hitchhiking. But then after that, the women largely stopped hitchhiking, apparently.
Personally, I find the letters that came from Maryland, Cumberland, Maryland, that were signed with a triangle, I find that really fascinating. They were sent on to the governor, and if they hadn't been sent on, then we may have never found their bodies. But someone had written these letters saying that they wanted to help them find the bodies, and here was a map. They drew a map, a terrible map. And they said that, hey, the animals are on the move. You need to find them quickly. And I think, 4 letters in total?
Yeah, there were 4. Spread over time. There was 1 letter sent on April 8th, and then another one mailed the 10th to correct people, because whoever was writing this, at the time they didn't know who was writing them. They were all handwritten. And he was trying to correct impressions that were coming over the news about where to look. And his claims about where the bodies were, he said, for instance, they're near a stream and in the woods. And as you know, around here, that's not information.
We're close to a stream and near the woods right now.
Yeah. So, you can't go anywhere in West Virginia really without being close to a stream and woods. So, they found Merritt's purse on March 2nd, or March 1st, I believe, March 1st. And they weren't, so the state police had started to look south of Morgantown and everything before the letters came. And then when the letters came, it said, look 25 miles south of Morgantown. And so a few troopers drove the directions, and they ended up in downtown Grafton. So they said, well, this isn't it. So they drove another mile and looked around, and they said, there's nothing here. Eventually the bodies were found 9 miles south of Morgantown rather than 25 as in the letters.
25 plus 1.
25 plus 1, which was odd.
Mm-hmm. But what do you think is the most interesting part of the case?
Well, I was surprised at how, one of the things she said one of the first times we got together was that Morgantown was really scary in the 70s. And I thought, I grew up here, I didn't think it was scary at all. It was scary. There was a lot of people doing bad things, especially to women in Morgantown. There was a lot of child abductions. There was a lot going on that never made the news, never was public, and it was in reports and things. The police were on it, but I don't know what they were doing about it. But there was just a lot of bad people doing bad things that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, that is interesting. So do you think that maybe you just had that perception since like you're like a man as opposed to like, you know, a woman in the 70s, or?
Well, plus I didn't have any back channel. There was no, I didn't, you know, the general public had no idea what the police were doing because, you know, that's all happening out of sight. And then it wasn't being really reported that much sometimes. But as I think Sarah pointed out, there would be an abduction or some kind of event, and it would get splashy news, and then when it actually got resolved, they found the guy or they stopped looking, whatever, it was printed in a small story in the back of the newspaper. So, you know,
Yeah.
people weren't aware that there was a constant search for bad people doing bad things.
Or when they were caught, a man was convicted of 12 attempted abductions, and we're not real sure how many of those were actually co-eds and how many were children, because technically co-eds, on anyone under the age of 21 was not considered an adult. So they were kind of grouped together. So 12 counts of attempted abduction, and he was put into psychiatric care for 3 months. That was his punishment. So
And there's another time the magistrate fined the guy some small amount, $30 or some kind of small amount of money for an assault on a woman. So there were very few laws against doing those kinds of things. Any kind of violence against women, that wasn't really a thing. So the police would always have to cobble together, you know, oh, well, that we charge him with abduction, assault, you know, they would cobble together things, but that's a lot less than ideal. I don't think that really started until the 80s.
yeah, around like 81.
Okay, so is there anything else that you think that somebody should know about the book or about you guys, or anything you want to put out there that I didn't ask?
I do want to mention that we had listed the pictures that we got from Brevard County of some necklaces and bracelets that had been taken from John Brennan Crutchley's house in 1985. And a lot of his victims have never been identified, so if people want to take a look at those pictures and maybe find out, hey, I know who this belongs to, that would be great.
We were looking specifically for 2 necklaces, one of Merritt's necklaces with a religious medallion, and then Karen had a necklace with a class ring dangling on it, and those were both missing. So when we found this Crutchley fella and discovered that he had a whole stash of necklaces, we thought, well, there might be. So we were in a lot of communication with the lead investigator down there, Bob Leatherow. And that's on the podcast, and we've got extensive interviews within the book.
There's also the detective magazines, if anyone wants to read those. We have those in PDF form, and you can see what the magazines printed versus what Clausen said in his confession and what was wrong with what was printed that he was regurgitating in his confessions.
Yeah, there were 30 to 35 mistakes in the articles, and Clausen just repeated those mistakes, and they were all completely wrong. So he gave, that's one of the reasons that Richard said, I don't think he did it, was that his confession was just like this magazine article. John Brennan Crutchley is the person that I think is likely to have done it. We've got a big circumstantial case against him. We haven't yet connected. Crutchley's sister was going to WVU at the time and was also a freshman. And so I think we can find a connection between her and Merritt and Karen, but we haven't found it yet. So
if anyone has anything to say about that, contact us.
yeah, Crutchley was from Clarksburg, so right down the road. And like I say, his older brother went to WVU med school, and his sister was a freshman in 1970.